Earth, a Love Story, written and read by Robin Lassiter. Chapter 3, Part 2. But then there was the weird stuff. That was magic too, but it was different. I didn't know it wasn't normal until later when I'd left home and the world was a very different place than where I'd grown up. And out of necessity, I took on the task of trying to parse out what was real, acceptable in the world, and what wasn't. Here's the weird stuff. Following my sister down the road on the way to the barn, the world spins too fast and I get dizzy and hear the call of sandhill cranes, louder and louder until it's the only sound I can hear. Suddenly I am with them, all surrounded by wind and blue and the cacophony of their rattling bugles. The wind is cold. All I can see are colors, blue and white and gray, and I am spinning with them, and it's so loud. And then everything is black and silent, and I'm laying on the ground, my body pulsing and shaking against the hard, cold, early spring earth. My sister turns around and trots back to me and helps me up, thinking I had tripped and fallen. "Did you hear the cranes?" I am gulping air. My sister cocks her head, closes one eye against the sun, and squints up into the blue sky. "Yeah," she points. "Look, there they are." She waits for me to say more, and when I don't, she grabs my hand. "Come on, let's go riding." When I was 4 or 5, I found myself out of my bed, downstairs, standing in our dark, quiet kitchen. My sister and I slept on one side of the loft, and my parents slept on the other. There were ladder-like stairs to get down from the loft, made of wood that creaked and popped under even my little kid weight. I could not have arrived in the kitchen without waking up my family, but there I was. I felt sleepy and curious and calm. This was not the land of dreams. I was awake, the cold floor real and solid under my bare feet. But I noticed that the air felt different. It was like being inside the shimmer of a mirage. The night was deep and black, but now there was a gentle orange light here too. In front of me was a tall, human-like figure with a dark, oily, red-brown, jointed exoskeleton. There was nothing warm or affectionate about him, but he wasn't menacing either. He did not speak, but communicated that he was there to check on me. It seemed as if he knew me, that we knew each other. I simply accepted this and thought, okay. I wondered if there was something I was supposed to do, but the next thing I knew, I was in bed and the night had passed. My memory of him is so clear, not just the vivid details of how he looked, his armored shoulders and small line of a mouth, the tiny sparse hairs covering his body, catching the glow of the strange orange light, but how he felt. His presence was just like anyone else's presence, in that it came with the feeling of him as a distinct being. My mother felt a certain way, emitted a certain frequency, and so did my sister and my father. I could feel each of them unique. I could feel him too, and still can when I think of him. In my head, I called him Ant-Man. I never told anyone about him, not for any real reason other than, again, he was just a new experience in the flood of new experiences of childhood. And later, well, how do you talk about something like that anyway? Many times I found myself floating out of my bed and then suddenly being outside, following a presence that beckoned me higher and higher. I was looking up, locked inside the experience, and didn't notice the landscape receding below, the dome and the valley getting smaller and smaller. Suddenly I looked down and saw the earth far below, and all at once I felt how far from home I was, how far there was to fall, and I became terrified. In slow motion, I started to fall from the sky, flailing my arms, grasping at nothing, as if my realization that there was something to fear removed the magic that was keeping me afloat. And then in an instant, I was back in my bed. I was scared and cold, and when I finally got back to sleep, I had a dream about the end of the world. I had these Armageddon, end-of-the-world dreams all the time. Vivid, intense dreams with no context, no place to put them. My family was not at all religious, but somehow I dreamed of big white crosses lined up on beaches, of persecution and crucifixion, and I dreamed of fighting. I dreamed of white explosions on the horizon. I dreamed of the planet becoming barren and then green. I dreamed of small villages and people in simple clothes tending lovely gardens inside the skeletons of once grand buildings. I saw the earth destroyed and regenerated dozens of times, and these dreams continued in their frequency and intensity until I was in my early 30s. I wrote to dead people, transcribing our conversations in slow, careful block letters because I hadn't yet learned cursive, into a spiral-bound notebook. You know, the kind you had in grade school with that soft, almost fuzzy paper and the light blue lines down the page. The people I spoke to were kind and elderly, a matching pair, a gray-haired man and woman, warm and familiar, in identical rocking chairs. They spoke to me and I wrote pages and pages, earnestly pressing our conversations into the soft paper with a big dull pencil. My parents found the notebook and sat me down, concerned and afraid. They asked me to explain what it meant, why I was writing about dead people. I got scared and defensive and explained they were my friends and they told me things, all sorts of things. My parents exchanged a glance and knelt in front of me, questioning me more, asking me what they were saying to me. Why was I talking to them? Did I want to be with them? Why were they talking to me about death? I felt trapped and confused and backed into a corner. I remember my body filling up with a righteous anger, and I glared at my parents while I ripped the pages out of the notebook. This was the same hot, throat-closing feeling I was now familiar with. I had to put this in the bad column in my perfection repulsion program, and I was not happy about it. I crumpled up the pages and threw them into the wood stove and watched the fire curl them into ash. My parents looked sad but shrugged and left me alone and never brought it up again. For a while, my mother had terrible back pain. She brought a physical therapist to the house to give her treatment. He told her that I was special and that he'd seen the ghosts of 2 young children following me around. She told me this and looked at me, appalled. "Can you believe he would say that?" she said. "How creepy." Secretly from then on, every time I went up the stairs, I heard them padding up behind me. I felt elated and afraid. I was a voracious reader growing up, and if I was reading a particularly good book, I would become somehow intoxicated by it. The intoxication manifested as fevered dream states, getting physically sick, obsessively playing out the story in my mind, and feeling the physical pains of the characters in the stories. I would wake up drenched in sweat and panting, having spent the night caught in the character's predicament, trying to bring about some resolution. Eventually, these episodes didn't happen only with literature. I would be overcome with the energy of the desire for resolution itself. One night I was laying in bed, soaked in that feeling, struggling with the friction of something unresolved. A torturous tension of opposites. The friction of something that wanted to be unified, but that I couldn't quite make happen. On the ceiling above me were 2 sinuous patches of color. There was red on one side and blue on the other, with matching curves so that they were pressed right up against one another. In the very center where they met was a pulsating, frenetic, electric white line. There was an alive, writhing tension there. I was pyretic, focused on that line, trying to bring about the resolution of the duality, the grating, scraping discord. That feeling, the sensation of trying to resolve something, trying to bring something into harmony or realization, has always been with me. I've spent hundreds of nights trying to align myself to something, trying to bring something together, trying to balance something out. I wake up tired and confused, barely able to describe the experience and certainly not finding it worth it to go through the trouble to try. My first UFO sighting happened when I was a child growing up in this valley. My cousins and sister and I were sleeping in the front yard after I'd had an earnest and serious conversation with my parents and aunts and uncles, assuring them that it was safe, that we wouldn't be eaten by a bear, and that they really needed to let this happen for us. We lined up our sleeping bags in the tent and took off the rain flap to get a clear view of the night sky. We watched the stars and talked and laughed, and at one point we saw a bright red dot zipping around in space above us. We'd seen a couple of satellites, so we knew what those were. This wasn't that. This red dot in the sky made right and left turns, flowed this way and that, went fast and slow and moved like it had an intelligence behind it. The next morning we went into the dome for breakfast and reported what we'd seen. To my delight, my folks told us that on the news that morning was a report of a UFO sighting across the world in Japan. The details of that sighting are fuzzy in my memory, but it didn't matter to me if they had seen exactly what we'd seen. In my mind, I saw no reason why the two wouldn't be related and took it as proof of what we'd witnessed. In high school, my best friend took the notes we'd exchanged during class to the school counselor because she was concerned. I was already deep into my first existential crisis, and I'd written to her that I believed God didn't make you go to hell if you killed yourself, that it didn't work like that. There wasn't a hell anyway, and while we're on the subject, what are we even doing here? Why was I sent here? If it's all eternal love and fluffy clouds on the other side, why come here at all? Is this a test? Is this a game? What are we doing here, really? Is it about going to school and getting good grades and wearing certain clothes and having people like you, and then college and then a job and retirement and death? For some reason, my 12-year-old nihilistic viewpoint freaked out my friend, and the school counselor made me sign something that said I promised not to kill myself, and I thought that was the most ridiculous thing I could imagine. My friend told my sister, and my sister told my mom, and she told me, "How could you say something like that?" but promised not to tell my dad. I thought the whole cascading experience was bizarre, so I stopped telling people things. That was probably a good idea, to stop telling people things, because at church camp, my sister and I had begged to start going to church, probably because of the 4 brothers who went who were our age. They told me that my dad and my gay friends were going to hell, and it was just how it was because God works in mysterious ways, and that was that. After a zealous speaker and a too big bonfire where we were encouraged to imagine the heat and pain of that fire burning our unsaved loved ones in writhing agony for all eternity, I told my camp counselor the story of my father's father dying on a road trip with his family, and his family coming home, shocked and numb, to the service led by a pastor who never knew my grandfather, saying it was a shame because he was such a good man and a good husband, but now he was burning in hell since he wasn't saved. They said that, I said, at my grandfather's funeral, to his family. The church camp folk ignored what I said, looked at me, and told me that there was only one unforgivable sin, and everyone always had the chance to repent before they died if they did not commit that sin. I asked what it was, and they told me it was to deny the Holy Spirit, and I didn't know what that meant, but I did it right then, defiantly, and went to join my grandfather and father and my friends in hell. I didn't go back to church or camp, and I knew if I kept getting ostracized from things, I'd be alone forever. So I tucked away my second gift, and it burrowed down into my heart and became my North Star. There are so many experiences around my second gift that I feel strange listing them all, as if I'm trying to prove something to you. The truth is that I've been trying to prove something to myself, something that it has taken a lifetime to accept and integrate, and as soon as I do and can, something new happens that draws me more deeply into the mystery. These experiences illustrate the strangeness I felt with the accepted reality, with its rules and restrictions and confusing absurdity, where it was okay to visit Yggdrasil but not talk to my dead friends. This fractured me too. All of these experiences were real for me, but only some of them were okay. I had no vocabulary for many of them anyway, but I did have a vast, rich, internal world that was sometimes okay to share and sometimes not. I had proof that there were other places to go, and there were other places to be, and I clung to that reality because it made more sense than the world where everyone except for me seemed fine. I needed the magic. Some part of my little psyche refused to release things that weren't allowed or that I couldn't explain. This became my secret world, and I loved it. Even then, at that young age, I couldn't bear the idea that this place was all just material, and what you see is what you get, and there wasn't a secret, invisible world underneath it all. That felt like bullshit. Snow snakes and Santa Claus. I received my third gift, because great things always come in threes, when I was 14 years old and my grandmother, my father's mother, was visiting. I felt how the space in the room contracted when they were together. I felt the tension in my father's back and smelled the menthol smoke in the air from my grandmother's cigarettes. I understood that my father hated that smoke. He hadn't come halfway across the country and live in a teepee for a year and find a wife and settle into a valley and build a home with his own two hands to have it filled with the same smoke and sickness from his childhood. He raged silently while my grandmother smoked incessantly. We didn't call her Grammy or Grandma or Grams. We called her Grandmother, with a capital G, and she smoked one cigarette after the next, lighting the new one from the old one's ember. Juxtaposed to my father's seething was my mother's peacekeeping, her smoothing over, her allowance. I watched this play out. I watched my grandmother smoke. I watched my father clench. I watched my mother acquiesce and try to keep everyone happy. There was something there, something around my perfection and repulsion program, something around my mother's allowing and my father's judgment, something around that obsessive desire that I had to resolve opposites into unity. There was something around the cigarette itself. As I watched, the cigarette became the representation of that tension in form. I could feel the discomfort in the room. I could feel it all clearly, as I always could, and I could feel that this was the dumb kind of suffering. There was no reprieve from that dumb suffering that I'd found anyway, and I knew all of these parts and players all too well, except for the cigarette itself. I was fascinated. When I saw that grandmother's suitcase held several cartons, I quietly stole a single pack. I stole the pack of cigarettes from grandmother and 2 red-tipped Strike Anywhere matches from the tin matchbox by the stove, and I stole a beautiful old hardbound book that no one read anymore from the bookshelf. I went to the dark woods behind the barn, behind a big rock, and I took a little knife my father had given me, and I cut out a cigarette pack-sized hole from the pages of the book. I laid the pack of cigarettes, a soft white and green pack with its shiny clear plastic, into the book until it fit just right. I took it out again and pulled the small red tab of plastic and unwound a thin strip and pulled off the top, revealing the silver folded foil. I peeled that away and pulled out a white cigarette. It was clean and smelled like mint and something rich and unfamiliar. I struck a match, and it took a few tries against the rough, damp rock, but it finally caught, and I remember the first breath of that smoke like I just breathed it. The cold, white menthol smoke filled my mouth and throat, and I choked and got immediately nauseous and then immediately lightheaded, and a high buzzing took over everything, and for a moment there was no thought. Nothing. No wondering about whether I was good or bad and how to tell, how to act or what to say to make sure I was safe and right and perfect. No shame remembering all of the things I'd done to fall into the other category, the painful, sick, rolling stomach category. There was just silence and height. I was above it all. I was above my body now, quiet and still instead of off to the side and watchful, and everything except for that feeling, that silence, seemed far away and unimportant. I inhaled again, and this time I didn't cough as much, and the whining high silence came back, and I sat in it with the smoke swirling around me until it dissipated. I carefully pressed the tip of the cigarette against the rock and extinguished the ember, and then I wiped away the dark smudge of ash it left there so that there was no trace. The cigarette and my fingers immediately stank, and I saw a faint brown-yellow spot that had appeared at the end of the filter. I pushed the cigarette, no longer straight and clean and white, but creased and dirty and smudged, back into the pack and put the pack back into the book. At the edge of Pan's woods, I knelt on the ground and scraped away pine needles, and I dug a hole into the damp, musty earth behind the big boulder where my sister and I never played. While I buried my secret, Pan looked down at me and grinned, hooves clacking on stone, and I received into my throat my third gift, all around the thrill of addiction and the relief of secrets. I picked some feathery soft sage and rubbed it between my palms until it released its oils, and then rubbed my fingers into that until they didn't stink anymore. I went back to the house, still high and heart pounding and already wondering when I could get away again for more. This third soul gift was a field, a vehicle, a way to explore the facets and richness of my other two gifts. This was my sovereignty. This place was mine alone, and it was dangerous and comforting and alive, and I didn't speak of it to anyone. These were the three gifts that I both received and chose. They became programs installed deep into my psyche, the perfect triumvirate to foster my evolution and to progress the turning of the wheel. They oversaw my initiation, my self-abandonment, my victimhood, my journey into the world of shadow, my empowerment, and my infinite returning to my own heart. I lived inside of these gifts through my childhood, through my junior high and high school years, developing and honing them. I learned that I could pretend to be whatever the person next to me preferred, and then I didn't ever have to step into the landmine of the repulsion, bad, wrong program. I refined my skill of learning what was acceptable, what got praise, where I felt safe, and figured if I could just get good enough at that, I'd never have to feel that sick shame again. Or maybe if I found the right person, the one who would notice how good I was being, they would take care of me and I could finally rest. I learned to read the tarot and painted my dreams. I felt a deep sense of unease with the outside world, the high school and you'd better start thinking about a career world, and made plans to run away with my best friend and live in a cave and hunt rabbits and be connected to the earth forever. But she got a boyfriend and cut open her stuffed bunny and pulled out its guts to make space for her birth control pills, and decided maybe it was better to stick around. Natural gas was found tucked underneath the valleys and hills and rocks and trees in the thousands of acres around us, and anyone who didn't own the mineral rights to their land got a scar of a road cut through it and a loud gas well installed on a flat, gravelled pad, breaking up the natural roll and rhythm of the land. We were lucky. They didn't come down and penetrate our valley, but the big belching dozers crept up and over the ridges around us and cut down magic trees and scraped away pinyon needles and sage and barrel cactus with red flowers and made big ugly holes in the horizon lines of pine trees on the ridges around us. I sat on Goat Rock and watched the first one crest the north ridge and cried and cried. There is nowhere on this earth that is exempt from the world as it is, and I cowered against it encroaching into my garden, and it broke my heart, and I shattered again. My parents split up for a while. My sister went away to Princeton, and I deepened into the familiar terrain within. I found other things to drink and eat and smoke that helped me feel right inside myself, and by the time I was supposed to go out into the world, I was fully immersed in my 3 sacred gifts. First, deep inside my gut, the paradox of being perfect and repulsive, my outsourcing of self, my longing for rescue. Next, buried in my heart, there was my North Star, my magic and unseen worlds and unexplainable experiences. And then, looping and swirling blue like smoke in my throat, my third gift, a way to soften and numb and temper and escape the others, my secret, my addictions. For more information, visit honeyheart.org.